At 11:35 p.m. on the 14th of November 1942, radar operators aboard the USS Washington watched green phosphorescent traces light up their SG radar screens, signaling the approach of Japanese warships. These ships, commanded by Vice Admiral Nova Kondo, were closing in fast and would be within firing range in less than 30 minutes. The officer in command of the American task force was Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, a 4-year-old Olympic shooting champion and the U.S. Navy's top radar expert. Lee had spent the last 2 years battling to convince senior officers that radar could revolutionize naval warfare. Most admirals distrusted the technology, considering it unreliable and too complicated for real combat. They preferred searchlights and visual identification, the methods that had been used in naval battles for centuries. But Lee understood something those traditional admirals did not. The Japanese had no functional fire control radar. Their ships relied solely on optical rangefinders and the exceptional night vision of their lookouts, honed by years of training. In darkness, Japanese gunners could only engage targets they could see. In contrast, American ships equipped with radar could detect, track, and fire on targets that were completely invisible to the naked eye. That technological advantage was about to make all the difference in the battle for Guadalcanal. The stakes could not have been higher. For 3 months, American Marines had been holding on to a fragile foothold on Guadalcanal, a tropical island few Americans had even heard of before the war. In August 1942, the Marines landed and seized a partially completed Japanese airfield that had been discovered through aerial reconnaissance. This airfield, renamed Henderson Field in honor of a fallen Marine aviator, became the focal point of one of the war's bloodiest campaigns. Control of Henderson Field meant control of the airspace around Guadalcanal, which in turn meant control of the sea approaches, allowing for reinforcements and supplies. The Japanese understood this perfectly and had been trying to destroy Henderson Field for months, sending bombers during the day and warships at night to bombard the airfield. American forces had been defending the field fiercely, flying patched-together aircraft against overwhelming odds, rationing ammunition, and burying their dead in the tropical heat. The campaign had already cost thousands of lives on both sides. Naval battles around the island were particularly brutal, and the waters north of Guadalcanal had earned the nickname Iron Bottom Sound, due to the dozens of ships that had been sunk in night battles. American cruisers like Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria had gone down in August during the Battle of Savo Island. More ships were lost in October and early November. The smell of death filled the air as oil slicks miles long marked the spots where ships had burned and sunk. Admiral Lee's mission was simple but crucial: prevent the Japanese from adding Henderson Field to the list of destroyed targets. But he needed the radar operators to execute their jobs flawlessly. Lee needed to trust the radar, electronic machines, over his own instincts and experience. He needed his crew to interpret patterns on glowing screens and translate them into accurate firing solutions quickly enough to save the Washington and its crew from a Japanese bombardment. Washington's radar operators had been training intensely since the ship entered the Pacific in September 1942. Arriving at Tonga on September 14, the SG surface search radar equipment was so new that formal Navy training programs were still being developed. The first SG radars had only gone to sea in April 1942, just 7 months earlier. Production models were being installed on ships as quickly as contractors like Rathon could manufacture them. The operators learned from technical manuals written by engineers who'd never been to sea and through practice during convoy escort missions, protecting reinforcements bound for Guadalcanal. The SG radar was a revolutionary leap forward in naval technology. It operated on 10 cm microwaves, part of the S-band, around 3 GHz. Much more precise than the older CXM air search system mounted on Washington's main mast, which used 1.5-meter wavelengths. While the CXM was good for detecting aircraft at long range, it was imprecise with surface targets. The SG radar's shorter wavelength produced sharp, clear returns, capable of identifying individual ships. Under ideal conditions, it could detect large surface targets like battleships at 18,000 yards. More than 10 miles. It could track multiple targets at once, displaying each one as a distinct green blip on the radar screen. Most importantly, it could see through darkness and heavy rain conditions that rendered the Japanese optical systems almost useless. While Japanese lookouts had exceptional night vision, trained through years of diet and exercise, they couldn't see through complete darkness or rain squalls. Radar could. Lee understood this technology better than most of his peers. In 1939, when many flag officers saw radar as experimental and irrelevant to combat, Lee had already recognized its potential. He had studied technical papers from the Naval Research Laboratory, visited radar contractors, and observed British radar systems before the war. He had been part of Fleet Problem 20 inches 1939, where prototype radar aboard the battleship New York detected destroyer attacks at ranges that made traditional night tactics obsolete. However, the radar system did have critical limitations. It couldn't identify what it was detecting. A destroyer and a battleship might appear as identical blips at long range. Land masses like Savo Island created radar shadows, and heavy seas could generate false returns that mimicked ships. The radar required constant interpretation by operators who understood its technical capabilities and naval tactics. A single, misidentified contact or an incorrect range estimate could cause American ships to maneuver blindly into devastating Japanese gunfire. The fundamental problem facing the U.S. Navy in November 1942 was that nobody at the Naval War College had developed a comprehensive doctrine for radar-guided surface combat. While radar had been proven in limited engagements, no one had fought a major fleet battle relying primarily on radar for fire control instead of visual sighting. Experienced admirals like Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott had commanded radar-equipped ships in earlier battles around Guadalcanal, but both had been killed in action. Rear Admiral Callahan had led from the San Francisco during the chaotic night battle of November 12 to 13. He had placed his radar-equipped ships toward the rear of his column, where their superior information couldn't reach him in time due to jammed communication channels. Callahan made critical decisions based on fragmentary visual reports, not radar, and was killed when Japanese shells hit San Francisco. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, who had commanded the task force during the Battle of Cape Esperance in October, had used radar to detect the Japanese first, gaining a tactical advantage. But he hesitated to trust the radar and waited for visual confirmation, costing valuable seconds. The battle turned into a melee, with the outcome shaped more by fortune and enemy mistakes than by effective radar use. Scott was killed in the same battle that claimed Callahan's life and was also awarded the Medal of Honor. Both men had shown exceptional courage but learned the hard way that bravery alone wasn't enough. Possessing radar meant little if commanders didn't understand how to use it effectively. In November 1942, nearly no one in the Navy understood radar's potential except for Admiral Lee. Lee had been advocating for radar integration since 1940 and had spent years mastering the JAR. Final life today on 5 today on 5 today, that also Posavik to the Massas of his buys system. He understood its capabilities, limitations, and tactical applications better than any other flag officer in the fleet. This expertise earned him command of Task Force 64, which consisted of the battleships Washington and South Dakota, along with 4 destroyers for screening no cruisers, no air cover, no reserve forces. The Japanese, led by Vice Admiral Nova Kondo, were coming with their most powerful surface force yet, including the battleship Kirishima, veteran of Pearl Harbor, and heavy cruisers Otago and Takao, along with light cruisers Suzuya and Nagara, 9 destroyers, and enough Type 93 long-range torpedoes to sink every American vessel within range. The Japanese goal was to destroy Henderson Field, which would effectively collapse the American position on Guadalcanal. Admiral Lee's mission was clear: stop them. If he succeeded, the Americans would hold Guadalcanal and continue their campaign. If he failed, the Japanese would resume their advance, and the war in the Pacific would take a significant turn in Japan's favor. At 10:30 p.m. on November 14, Washington's SG radar detected contacts 18,000 yards away, heading in from the northwest. The battle was about to begin. At 11:35 p.m. on the 14th of November 1942, the radar plot aboard the USS Washington identified 2 columns of Japanese warships moving at 21 knots toward Savo Sound, following their typical operational patterns. This information reached Admiral Lee on the bridge within seconds, thanks to a communication system he had personally redesigned. Normally, naval practice involved a multi-step process. Radar operators would report contacts to a talker, who would relay the information to the bridge officer, who would then inform the admiral, and the orders would be passed back down the chain of command. This system took time that could cost lives, as enemy ships closed in, maneuvering into attack positions. Lee, however, bypassed these traditional procedures. Communication system so that the radar plot officer could instantly relay contact details, position, bearing, range, and movement to the gunnery officer, the main battery plotting room, and the gun director stations. There were no communication delays, no misunderstandings, or critical data lost in translation. It was a revolutionary approach for its time, and while it violated peacetime regulations and standard operating procedures, Lee implemented it because he understood that in radar-guided combat, speed of information was crucial for survival. Lee stood beside Captain Glenn Davis on the Washington's bridge. Davis, a 50-year-old ordnance expert, was deeply familiar with ballistics, trajectory calculations, and fire control systems. He and Lee had worked closely together to develop the ship's radar-directed gunnery procedures during its training in the Pacific. They had drilled the crew relentlessly on radar operations and fire control coordination. This would be the Washington's first combat engagement, and Lee knew it would test everything they had trained for. As soon as the radar plot identified the enemy ships, the Washington crew sprang into action. An electronic bell sounded 2 short rings, signaling the crew to prepare for action. Crews scrambled to their battle stations. Damage control teams positioned themselves, ready to respond to fires or flooding. In the radar plot room, operators adjusted their equipment as the radar returned increasingly clear signals. The range closed, and the contacts resolved into distinct groups. One group of Japanese ships moving east of Tsavo Island, including the light cruiser Sendai and 3 destroyers. Another group approaching from the north, with the light cruiser Nagara leading 6 destroyers. The main Japanese force, including the battleship Kirishima, heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, was heading directly toward Henderson Field. The Japanese had no idea the Washington was waiting for them. There, reconnaissance aircraft had detected American ships earlier in the day, but the reports were contradictory. Some thought they had spotted cruisers and destroyers. Others thought they had seen aircraft carriers. The confusion was understandable. Japanese naval doctrine didn't anticipate American battleships operating in the narrow, reef-strewn waters around Guadalcanal at night. It seemed an unlikely place for capital ships to fight, but it was perfect for a radar-guided ambush. At 11:17 p.m., Washington's radar detected the Japanese screening force at 14,000 yards. 4 American destroyers, Benham, Preston, Gwynn, and Wickes, opened fire with their 5-inch guns, engaging the destroyer screen protecting the main Japanese force. Within minutes, the battle descended into chaos. Japanese destroyers launched spreads of Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, the most advanced torpedoes in the world. American destroyers frantically maneuvered to avoid the torpedoes they couldn't see in the prospect. Darkness. One torpedo hit Wickes, blowing off her bow and detonating her forward magazine. She sank in minutes, taking most of her crew with her. Preston was hit multiple times and exploded into flames. Benham suffered a torpedo hit that blew off her bow, though the rest of the ship remained afloat. Gwynn, the only surviving destroyer, was ordered to withdraw and escort the crippled Benham. Meanwhile, the South Dakota, stationed behind the Washington, was facing a disastrous electrical failure. At approximately 11:30 p.m., a shock from firing South Dakota's turret caused circuit breakers to fail, and the ship's radar systems and fire control computers went down. Power was partially restored by 11:58. But more failures soon occurred due to continued shock from the main battery firing. For critical minutes, the South Dakota operated blind, unable to detect enemy ships on radar or control her guns. A navigation error brought the ship dangerously close to the wrecks of destroyed American destroyers. The Japanese searchlights illuminated her, and nearly every Japanese ship immediately turned its fire on her, landing 27 hits from 14-inch and 8-inch shells. Thankfully, the Japanese had loaded high-explosive shells rather than armor-piercing ones, which were meant for shore bombardment, not penetrating ship armor. While the shells devastated South Dakota's superstructure, knocking out radar and fire control systems, and killed 39 crew members, they didn't penetrate the ship's main armor belt. At 12:12 a.m., Captain Thomas Gatt decided that the ship could no longer effectively contribute to the battle and requested permission from Admiral Lee to withdraw. Lee granted the request, and South Dakota pulled back, fighting fires and making repairs. Now, Washington was alone, facing the full force of the Japanese fleet. Lee maneuvered the ship carefully, using the fires from the burning destroyer Preston as a screen, while South Dakota drew the Japanese's attention. Japanese, focused on South Dakota, failed to detect Washington lurking in the darkness. Washington's radar operators tracked every Japanese ship with precision. At approximately midnight, Washington's SG radar detected Kirishima at 8,400 yards, which was point-blank range for her 16-inch guns. The ship could hardly miss at that range. Captain Davis received the radar tracking data and issued the order. The main battery directors acquired targets based solely on radar information. The fire control radar calculated trajectory, adjusted for ship movement, target motion, wind, and air density, and fed the data into analog fire control computers deep inside the ship. At exactly midnight, Washington opened fire. 9 16-inch shells, each weighing 2,700 pounds, left the barrels at 2,600 feet per second. The muzzle blast was so powerful that it knocked sailors off their feet on the main deck. The shells arced through the darkness, striking Kirishima's forward section. Her bridge exploded. Her forward 14-inch gun turrets fell silent, and her deck armor was penetrated by armor-piercing shells. Fires erupted throughout her superstructure, and her steering and hydraulic systems were damaged, forcing her into an uncontrolled turn. In just 7 minutes, Washington fired 75 rounds of 16-inch armor-piercing shells at Kirishima. The exact number of hits is debated, but American observers estimated 9 hits based on splash observations, while Japanese damage control reports recorded 20 major caliber hits. The secondary battery of 5-inch guns fired an additional 107 rounds, further devastating Kirishima's superstructure, destroying fire control stations, and killing crew members. On the Japanese side, Kirishima's officers were baffled. They saw muzzle flashes, felt the impacts, but couldn't determine where the fire was coming from. They fired blindly, but their shells missed, passing over Washington's superstructure. The engagement was one-sided, with Washington using radar to target Kirishima in complete darkness, a technology the Japanese couldn't understand or counter. Kirishima couldn't see Washington at all. It was like fighting a ghost. Every time the Japanese gunners thought they had located the American battleship's position based on muzzle flashes, Washington maneuvered using radar data to track the Japanese ship's movements, staying ahead of their aim. The Japanese were firing high-explosive shells with impact fuses, meant for the planned shore bombardment of Henderson Field. These shells, designed for softer targets, were far less effective against the thick armor of a battleship. When the Japanese shells from Kirishima and the cruisers hit South Dakota earlier, they caused considerable damage but failed to penetrate the armor. However, Washington's armor-piercing rounds were specifically designed to penetrate heavy ship armor and explode inside the hull. Many of Washington's shells missed Kirishima, striking the water short of the target and continuing underwater. These underwater hits caused catastrophic flooding below the waterline, where the armor was thinner to reduce weight. Although Kirishima was well designed with extensive watertight compartments, it couldn't survive 20 hits from Washington's 16-inch guns fired at near point-blank range, with near-perfect accuracy. By 12:30 a.m. on November 15, Kirishima was finished. She was dead in the water, listing 18 degrees to starboard, with uncontrollable fires and flooded magazines. Over 200 crew members were dead or dying. Captain Iwabuchi had lost all control of the ship, which began to circle helplessly. Japanese destroyers, Asagumo and Samidare, attempted to tow Kirishima, but the damage was too severe. The flooding couldn't be controlled, and the list continued to increase. At 3:25 a.m. on November 15, Captain Iwabuchi ordered the ship abandoned. 1,198 crew members were rescued by Japanese destroyers before Kirishima capsized and sank in Iron Bottom Sound, 7.5 miles northwest of Tsavo Island. Kirishima's loss ended Admiral Kondo's bombardment mission. Without Kirishima to provide heavy gunfire to destroy Henderson Field's runway, the operation became meaningless. Kondo ordered his remaining ships to retreat at high speed. The Japanese destroyers launched torpedo spreads at Washington to cover the retreat, but all missed. Using radar, Washington successfully evaded the torpedoes, tracking their wakes and calculating evasion courses. Lee chose not to pursue into waters where additional Japanese submarines or surface forces might be lying in ambush. The battle was over, Henderson Field was saved, and the Marines on Guadalcanal would continue to receive supplies. The significance of Washington and Lee's success would reverberate through the remainder of the Pacific War and fundamentally change naval warfare. For the first time, an American commander had conclusively demonstrated that radar-based fire control could win a major surface engagement against a well-trained and determined enemy. The implications were immediate and profound. The battle showed that, when used effectively, technology could overcome numerical inferiority and traditional tactical advantages. Within weeks, every American admiral in the Pacific was clamoring for radar-equipped ships and operators trained in the new systems. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, issued urgent orders to accelerate radar installations on all combat vessels. Training programs were quickly set up at Pearl Harbor, on the West Coast, and later in dedicated facilities in Hollywood, Florida. Radar operators, once considered technical specialists of secondary importance, became critical combat personnel. Their skills were now seen as vital to determining victory or defeat. The concept of Combat Information Centers, CIC, was born from the lessons learned at Guadalcanal. Before the battle, radar data was scattered across the ship. Radar operators would report contacts to the bridge, and gun directors received data separately. There was no central place where all information could be gathered and analyzed. After reviewing Lee's after-action reports, Admiral Nimitz and his staff realized this was a major flaw. By the spring of 1943, American ships were being retrofitted with CICs, darkened rooms deep within the ship, where radar displays, radio communications, and plotting tables were concentrated. Officers in the CIC could see the entire tactical situation, correlating information from multiple sources to provide commanders with a comprehensive view of the battle. This was revolutionary. For the first time, a commander could see both friendly and enemy forces simultaneously, track their movements, predict their intentions, and issue orders based on complete information rather than fragmented reports and assumptions. By 1944, every American warship had a functioning CIC, with officers specifically trained to interpret radar, coordinate air, defense, direct fighter aircraft, and support navigation. The CIC became the nerve center of the ship in combat, as crucial as the bridge or engine room. This organizational innovation, which stemmed directly from Lee's use of radar at Guadalcanal, gave American forces an overwhelming tactical advantage in later battles in the Pacific. The psychological impact on the Japanese was equally significant. For 2 years since Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval forces had dominated night surface combat, relying on superior training, optical equipment, and aggressive tactics. Their lookouts, trained to spot American ships in the darkness, had been a key advantage. Their Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, powered by oxygen and nearly weightless, could hit targets at distances over 20,000 yards, far beyond the reach of American torpedoes. Japanese tactics emphasized aggressive, offensive action, closing quickly with the enemy, exploiting maneuverability, and unleashing overwhelming firepower. But these advantages became useless against radar-guided fire control. The Battle of Tsavo Island in August had been a catastrophic loss for the Americans, with 4 heavy cruisers sunk in less than an hour. The Battle of Cape Esperance had been inconclusive, and the first naval battle for Guadalcanal had been savage and costly for both sides. But none of these traditional Japanese advantages mattered against American radar. After the battle, Admiral Kondo filed a detailed report. Japanese staff officers interviewed survivors from Kirishima, and their reports painted a disturbing picture for Japanese naval command. American ships had somehow detected Kondo's force and opened fire with pinpoint accuracy before the Japanese lookouts saw anything. Despite the darkness and smoke, American shells hit with uncanny precision. The Japanese, once confident in their ability to maneuver and spot enemy ships in the dark, realized that their optical superiority was no match for American electronic systems. Kondo concluded that the Americans had developed some new technological advantage that rendered their traditional training and tactics obsolete. Although the Japanese knew their own radar development had lagged behind that of the Americans, they couldn't fully understand how it had been integrated so successfully into combat. Japan had its own radar research programs, but they had been deprioritized in favor of other weapons development. Japanese radar was years behind the U.S. and British systems. By the time Japan began deploying fire control radar late in the war, the strategic situation had already turned decisively against them. Japan's limited industrial capacity couldn't compete with America's overwhelming production capacity. American ships, equipped with the latest radar, joined the fleet monthly, while Japanese shipyards struggled to replace losses. The strategic calculus had shifted. The Japanese had lost 2 battleships, Hiei on November 13 and Kirishima on November 15 in just 3 days. They had lost cruisers, destroyers, and countless other vessels. Their naval forces had suffered staggering casualties, and their ability to launch large-scale naval reinforcements to Guadalcanal was effectively over. The Japanese finally gave up their efforts to reinforce Guadalcanal, focusing instead on fast destroyer runs, known as the Tokyo Express, to deliver minimal supplies. But these runs couldn't sustain the 17,000 Japanese soldiers on the island, who were increasingly isolated, starving, and ravaged by disease. Despite their courage, the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were ultimately defeated. By the end of January 1943, Japan executed an evacuation that successfully rescued around 11,000 soldiers. But the strategic reality was clear. They had been decisively defeated. The loss of 2 battleships and the inability to resupply their forces on Guadalcanal marked the turning point of the war. The Japanese had failed to achieve their objectives, and the American position was secure. The Battle of Guadalcanal had not only secured a vital strategic location for the Allies, but also marked the beginning of a new era in naval warfare, where radar and technology would change the nature of combat forever. The American losses during the Guadalcanal campaign, though heavy, were replaceable. The Japanese, however, suffered irreparable losses. After Washington sank Kirishima, the campaign was effectively over. The Marines held on to Henderson Field. American supply convoys reached the island safely, protected by Henderson Field's aircraft, and the Japanese ground forces, isolated and starving, were evacuated in a skillful withdrawal operation in February 1943. This evacuation saved lives, but marked a total strategic defeat for Japan. From that point on, Japan would no longer launch major offensives in the Pacific. Instead, they focused on defensive campaigns, trading space for time, hoping for a negotiated settlement that would never come. The naval battle of Guadalcanal is widely regarded as the turning point of the Pacific War. Before November 1942, Japan had been advancing across the Pacific. After November 1942, Japan was in retreat, never again regaining the strategic initiative. The shift was not solely due to ships, aircraft, or industrial capacity, though these factors were significant. The decisive factor was the effective integration of radar technology, which one side had mastered and exploited while the other had not. Admiral Lee received the Navy Cross for his actions on November 14th and 15th, with the citation highlighting his superior use of radar and aggressive tactics, despite facing numerically superior Japanese forces. Captain Davis also received the Navy Cross, recognized for his expert ship handling and coordination under intense combat conditions. However, the radar operators who made the victory possible received no medals or individual commendations. Their names appeared only in the crew roster and casualty lists, with no mention in the official histories written after the war. After the war, Admiral Lee continued to command fast battleships throughout 1943 and 1944 leading shore bombardment missions to support marine amphibious assaults and commanding the battleship screen protecting carrier task forces. In March 1944, he was promoted to Vice Admiral and appointed commander of the Battleship Pacific Fleet. In May 1945, as victory over Japan seemed certain, Lee was sent to the Atlantic to lead research into defenses against kamikaze aircraft, which had caused heavy casualties during the Okinawa campaign. Tragically, on the 25th of August 1945, just 10 days after Japan's surrender, Vice Admiral Willis Augustus Lee died of a sudden heart attack at the age of 57. His obituary mentioned his Olympic gold medals in shooting, his command during the Battle of Guadalcanal, and his contributions to naval gunnery and tactics. However, it did not emphasize his groundbreaking work in proving that radar could revolutionize naval surface warfare. Captain Glenn Davis remained in the Navy after the war and went on to command battleship divisions. He served as the Commodore of the Washington Navy Yard and as the Superintendent of the Naval Gun Factory. Davis retired as a Vice Admiral in 1953 and spent the post-war years working in the civilian shipping industry. He also wrote extensively about naval gunnery and radar, emphasizing that possessing advanced technology was useless without the training and proficiency to use it effectively. He repeatedly stressed that the Navy had won at Guadalcanal because a dedicated group of officers and enlisted men had mastered radar long before the rest of the fleet trusted the technology. The radar operators, whose work made the victory possible, mostly returned to civilian life after the war. They rarely discussed their wartime experiences in detail. Radar operation was seen as a technical specialty, not a combat role deserving of medals. The glory went to officers who made command decisions, gunners who fired the weapons, and damage control teams who saved ships. But no one in 1942 gave medals to the men who read electronic screens and provided critical targeting information that decided the battle. The SG radar, used aboard Washington during the battle, eventually found its place in the Smithsonian Institution's collection, displayed alongside other period naval equipment. The museum placard mentions Washington's role in the Battle of Guadalcanal and Admiral Lee's decisive victory. But it doesn't acknowledge the radar operators who made it all possible. Their contribution remains largely invisible to museum visitors and historians. This is how innovation happens in war, not through engineering committees or carefully planned programs, but through individuals who master new technologies before others recognize their revolutionary potential. Men like Admiral Lee, who understood radar's potential when others dismissed it as unreliable. Men like Captain Davis, who redesigned communication procedures to integrate radar into fire control. And men like the anonymous radar operators, whose names are largely forgotten, who read patterns on glowing screens and turned them into targeting information that sank an enemy battleship in just 7 minutes. The Battle of Guadalcanal proved that information dominance had become the new currency of naval power. The side that could see the farthest, react the fastest, and coordinate most effectively would win, regardless of numbers or traditional firepower advantages. The Japanese learned this lesson too late. By the time they fully understood the capabilities of American radar, American shipyards were mass-producing radar-equipped vessels faster than the Japanese could build anything at all. The technological gap became an industrial gap, leading to an insurmountable strategic advantage for the U.S. Navy. In November 1942, the outcome of the Pacific War was still uncertain. Hiroshima could have destroyed Henderson Field, Guadalcanal could have been lost, and the Marines could have been defeated. But what prevented this catastrophic outcome wasn't destiny or divine intervention. It was 7 minutes of radar-guided gunfire, executed by a dedicated team who had mastered a revolutionary system that the rest of the fleet had not yet fully trusted or understood. This was the true turning point of the war.